Christopher Vance was 34 years old when his life shifted permanently on a Tuesday evening last October. Inside the grand ballroom of the Arlington Officers Club, his stepbrother Brandon, a newly promoted and exceptionally cocky Navy SEAL, publicly challenged Christopher's authority over a matter of family inheritance and military protocol. Brandon's fingers wrapped tightly around a crystal tumbler, his voice ringing across the room as he dismissed Christopher as an insignificant civilian clerk who understood nothing of power or sacrifice. He did not notice the heavy gold signet ring on Christopher's finger or the calm stillness in Christopher's eyes as the insult hung in the air. Within 20 minutes, the doors of the ballroom opened, and every commanding general in the room stood at absolute attention before the quiet stranger. Before the narrative unfolds further, consider joining our community by subscribing, but only if stories of dignity, quiet patience, and earned vindication resonate with your personal journey. The architecture of the Vance family had always been built upon a strict, unspoken hierarchy where appearances outweighed authenticity. Arthur Vance, Christopher's stepfather, had spent 3 decades managing a prominent regional bank branch, a position that required an unblemished suit, a perfectly manicured lawn, and an unwavering commitment to social standing. To Arthur, the world was divided into those who commanded authority and those who merely followed orders, and he designed his household to reflect this philosophy. When Eleanor married Arthur, bringing her young son Christopher into the home, the dynamics adjusted to accommodate Arthur's rigid expectations. 2 years later, Brandon was born, and the trajectory of the household became entirely centered around the achievements of the biological son. Brandon was an energetic, loud child who demanded the center of every room he entered, a trait that Arthur encouraged with expensive sports equipment and public praise. Christopher, by contrast, was a quiet, observant boy who preferred the company of books, historical journals, and structural models. While Brandon's adolescent football trophies were displayed prominently on the mahogany mantelpiece in the living room, Christopher's perfect report cards were quietly placed in a kitchen drawer, acknowledged only with a brief nod from his mother. Eleanor quickly learned that her path to a peaceful marriage lay in reinforcing Arthur's preferences, and so she adopted the habit of organizing the family's social calendar entirely around Brandon's schedules. This favoritism was crystallized during a formal dinner party held in the summer of Christopher's 17th year, celebrating Brandon's selection for a regional elite athletic camp. The dining table was covered in the finest white linen, and the air smelled of roasted garlic and expensive beeswax candles. Arthur stood at the head of the table, his wineglass raised high, describing Brandon as the true torchbearer of the Vance family legacy, a young man destined for greatness and elite military service. Christopher sat at the far end of the table, his hands resting quietly in his lap, listening to his stepfather speak for 20 minutes without making a single reference to Christopher's recent acceptance into a prestigious federal honors program. When a guest politely inquired about Christopher's summer plans, Eleanor quickly intervened, stating that Christopher would be staying home to assist with the household archives and garden maintenance, ensuring that the focus remained firmly on Brandon. Throughout these formative years, Christopher's sole refuge was his biological grandfather, a retired military logistics specialist named George. George lived in a small, white-paneled house 3 miles away, where the rooms smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and cedarwood. Unlike Arthur, who viewed authority as something to be shouted from a podium, George understood that true power lay in the silent management of resources, lines of supply, and deep institutional knowledge. During weekend visits, George would sit with Christopher at a worn oak table, teaching him the intricacies of federal frameworks, administrative law, and the quiet art of observation. George was the first to recognize that Christopher possessed a rare, analytical mind capable of seeing 3 moves ahead in any administrative or strategic environment. It was George who quietly established a modest educational trust for Christopher, away from Arthur's scrutiny, ensuring that his grandson would have the independence required to pursue his own path. When George passed away during Christopher's final year of university, he left behind a leather-bound journal and a single silver key to a safety deposit box, whispering that patience was the ultimate strategic advantage. Christopher absorbed this lesson completely, carrying it forward into his early adult life while his family remained entirely oblivious to his intellectual development. Part 3. Mistreatment montage. The years that followed George's passing provided a continuous sequence of moments that solidified Christopher's marginalization within the Vance family. Each event was marked by a distinct sensory reality that Christopher recorded in his memory with analytical precision, never allowing his face to show the impact of the slights. The first significant incident occurred in May of 2014, the weekend of Christopher's college graduation. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and humid northern air as Christopher stood in the courtyard of his university, holding a degree in international relations and federal logistics. He had graduated near the top of his class, an achievement that had required thousands of hours of quiet study in the dark corners of the university library. Despite receiving the invitation months in advance, Arthur and Eleanor arrived 40 minutes late, their sedan pulling up to the curb just as the crowd began to disperse. Arthur did not exit the vehicle. Instead, he rolled down the window, the air conditioning blowing cold against Christopher's face, and handed him a plain white envelope containing a $50 bill. Eleanor offered a hurried apology, explaining that Brandon had a crucial varsity scrimmage that afternoon that required their presence. They departed within 3 minutes, leaving Christopher alone on the pavement, the gold tassel of his graduation cap catching the late afternoon sun. 2 years later, in December of 2016, the mistreatment took on a financial dimension during the reading of a distant aunt's estate distribution. The family gathered in the austere oak-paneled office of a local attorney where the radiator clanked rhythmically against the wall, releasing the dry smell of heated dust. The attorney read through the provisions of the minor inheritance, which detailed a small parcel of land and a modest sum of money intended to support the higher education of the grandchildren. Arthur, acting as the executor of the family's local affairs, presented a pre-drafted document that effectively transferred Christopher's portion of the funds directly to Brandon's military preparation fees and elite training seminars. When Christopher raised a calm, logical objection, noting the explicit language of the will, Arthur leaned across the table, his voice low and dismissive, stating that Brandon was entering the Navy to serve his country at the highest level, while Christopher was merely a low-level federal employee whose financial needs were minimal. Eleanor remained silent, her fingers tracing the seam of her leather handbag, refusing to look at her eldest son. Christopher signed the waiver without another word, his signature sharp and steady on the parchment. By the summer of 2019, Brandon had successfully completed his basic underwater demolition training, earned his Navy SEAL Trident, and returned home for a brief leave before his first deployment. His arrival transformed the household into a constant celebration of martial achievement. On a humid evening in July, the family gathered on the backyard patio, where the smell of charcoal smoke and grilled meat filled the air. Brandon sat in the center of a circle of neighbors, his chest expanded beneath his uniform shirt, describing his training with vivid, aggressive terminology. When Christopher arrived from his office in Washington wearing a standard charcoal gray suit and carrying a leather briefcase, Brandon laughed openly, calling him the family scribe who spent his days shifting paper from one side of a desk to the other. Arthur joined in the laughter, remarking that while one son was defending the nation with his bare hands, the other was ensuring the printers had enough paper. Christopher quietly set his briefcase down, accepted a glass of water, and spent the evening listening to his brother's boasts, his mind noting the exact regularities of Brandon's psychological need for dominance. The final escalation occurred in the autumn of 2022, during the planning of Arthur and Eleanor's 31st wedding anniversary. Christopher had spent 3 months coordinating the event, booking a refined dining room at a historic inn, selecting a classical trio, and quietly paying the $5,000 deposit from his own savings. On the evening of the celebration, as the 30 guests sat before plates of seared duck and fine crystal glasses, Brandon arrived unannounced, straight from an overseas assignment, wearing his full-dress uniform adorned with medals. The room immediately erupted in applause, the focus of the anniversary instantly shifting to Brandon's unexpected return. During the main toast, Arthur stood up, looked directly past Christopher, and thanked Brandon for giving the family a true reason to be proud, omitting any mention of Christopher's months of preparation or financial contribution to the evening. As the servers cleared the tables, the clinking of porcelain providing a steady background rhythm, Christopher sat in his chair, his hands clasped loosely, realizing that within this family unit, his value would always be calculated at zero. Part 4, Inciting Incident. The definitive fracture occurred on November 14, 2024. An unseasonably cold Thursday evening when a thin layer of frost coated the windows of Arthur and Eleanor's formal dining room. The gathering was small, intended to be a private family meeting to discuss the final settlement of Grandfather George's remaining historical property, a beautiful small plot of lakeside land that George had explicitly intended for Christopher to use as a personal retreat. Christopher sat on the dark green sofa, the fabric cool against his arms, while Brandon stood by the fireplace, his large frame blocking the warmth of the hearth. Arthur opened a leather portfolio on the coffee table, the snap of the metal ring binder echoing sharply in the quiet room. Without consulting Christopher, Arthur announced that he had negotiated the sale of the lakeside property to a commercial developer for $350,000. The proceeds, Arthur explained with an air of absolute finality, would be used to purchase a luxury sports car and finance a high-end training facility for Brandon, who was planning to launch a private security consultation firm upon the completion of his current military contract. Christopher looked at the documents on the table, his voice remaining perfectly level as he spoke. He reminded his stepfather that the land had been left to him in a memorandum attached to George's core estate, and that its preservation was a matter of historical respect. Brandon stepped away from the fireplace, his boots clicking heavily on the hardwood floor. He leaned over Christopher, his face inches away, his breath smelling faintly of coffee and tobacco. He stated that a quiet clerk who spent his life hiding behind a desk had no use for land, whereas a Navy SEAL required resources to build an empire. Brandon then reached down, took Christopher's copy of the historical land deed from his hands, and threw it into the roaring fireplace, watching the old paper curl and blacken in the flames. Arthur watched the destruction without moving, nodding his approval as he told Christopher that Brandon's career took precedence over sentimentality. Eleanor looked out the window, her fingers tightly intertwined, refusing to intervene as the ashes drifted up the chimney. Christopher did not stand up quickly, he did not raise his voice or express anger. He watched the paper turn to gray ash, then looked at his stepbrother's face, noting the smirk of absolute certainty. Christopher simply stood, adjusted his necktie, picked up his trench coat, and walked out into the cold November night, the front door closing behind him with a soft, definitive click. The morning after the incident, Christopher arrived at his office in Washington at 6 o'clock. Long before the administrative building began to fill with the murmur of daily staff. His true professional identity, completely hidden from his family through years of vague descriptions and deliberate modesty, was that of the Senior Director of Global Logistics and Procurement Oversight for the Department of Defense. He possessed an administrative security clearance that placed him at the functional center of military supply chains, contractor compliance, and high-level personnel assignments across every branch of the armed forces. For years he had kept his personal life and his immense professional authority entirely separate. But his stepbrother's actions had now introduced a necessity for strategic alignment. Christopher sat at his polished mahogany desk, the gray morning light illuminating the neat stacks of folders before him. He unlocked his secure terminal and activated a hidden resource that had been carefully maintained since his grandfather's passing. A comprehensive administrative audit protocol designed to track irregular financial interests and unauthorized commercial ventures among active-duty military personnel. He knew that Brandon's cockiness had likely left a trail of paperwork, particularly regarding his planned private security consultation firm. Christopher spent the next 4 hours analyzing corporate filings, looking for connections between Brandon's active-duty status and unauthorized commercial contracts. His analytical mind quickly discovered exactly what he expected. Brandon had been using his military designation and access to proprietary tactical training data to secure lucrative future commitments from private defense contractors, a direct violation of federal maritime law and Department of Defense ethics regulations. Furthermore, Brandon had listed Arthur's regional bank branch as the primary financial repository for these unauthorized funds, implicating his stepfather in a complex web of compliance failures. Christopher did not act immediately. He methodically compiled the evidence into 3 identical digital portfolios, each protected by high-level encryption. Over the next 3 weeks, Christopher demonstrated the precise competence that had made him an indispensable asset to the Pentagon. He scheduled private consultations with senior compliance attorneys, federal investigators, and high-ranking military magistrates. He did not ask for favors, he simply presented the objective data, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. Every meeting was conducted with the same calm, businesslike demeanor that characterized his daily administrative duties. His colleagues watched him work with a mixture of respect and quiet awe, recognizing that Christopher was executing a flawless institutional maneuver that would leave no room for escape. Yet, despite his absolute competence, there was one evening in late November when doubt flickered within Christopher's mind. He sat in his small, quiet apartment, surrounded by his grandfather's old books, holding the silver key George had given him. He questioned whether he was being too clinical, whether the bonds of shared childhood should warrant a softer approach. He stared at the key for an hour, remembering the smell of his grandfather's study and the black ashes of the land deed curling in the fireplace. He realized that true justice was not an act of anger, but a restoration of balance, and that allowing arrogance to compromise institutional integrity would be a failure of his own duty. The doubt dissolved, replaced by a cold, unwavering clarity. As the date of the annual Defense Logistics Gala approached, Christopher finalized his arrangements. He ensured that the event would host the highest concentration of senior military leadership in the region, including 6 four-star generals who oversaw the very branches Brandon relied upon for his career advancement. Christopher quietly arranged for his name to be added to the official executive protocol list, ensuring his true rank would be recognized at the appropriate moment, while leaving the general guest list entirely unaware of his specific role. He had his dress suit tailored with precise attention to detail, placing his official department identification badge inside his breast pocket, ready for the evening that would redefine everything. The Arlington Officers Club was brilliant with the light of 3 massive crystal chandeliers on the evening of December 14th. More than 200 guests filled the room, a sea of formal black tie attire, dark blue dress uniforms, and the glint of polished gold medals. The air was filled with the low hum of polite conversation, the gentle melody of a live string quartet, and the occasional chime of silver hitting crystal. Arthur, Eleanor, and Brandon stood near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by a small group of retired officers and local businessmen who were listening intently to Brandon's descriptions of his recent maritime operations. Christopher entered the room through a side door, unnoticed by his family. He wore a perfectly fitted black tuxedo, his posture upright and relaxed, his hands resting easily by his side. He observed his stepbrother from a distance of 20 feet, noting the way Brandon gestured expansively with his champagne glass, his voice carrying over the crowd as he boasted about his upcoming private venture and his absolute authority within his tactical unit. Arthur was the first to notice Christopher's approach. A look of mild annoyance crossed the older man's face as he stepped forward, his voice a low, harsh whisper as he asked Christopher why he had shown up to an event that was clearly meant for individuals of significant military achievement. Brandon turned around, a condescending smile on his face, and remarked loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear that the family clerk had managed to find his way out of the archives for one evening. He reached out, intending to tap Christopher's shoulder mockingly, but Christopher stepped back slightly, a movement so subtle and dignified that Brandon's hand met only empty air. Christopher looked directly into Brandon's eyes, his voice exceptionally calm, clear, and perfectly modulated as he spoke. He stated that authority within the armed forces was not determined by the volume of one's voice or the arrogance of one's posture, but by one's adherence to the code of conduct and institutional integrity. Brandon laughed openly, his face reddening as he asked what a quiet civilian stranger could possibly know about authority, demanding that Christopher leave the circle immediately before he had him removed by security. At that exact moment, the heavy double doors at the front of the ballroom swung open. The room fell into an immediate, profound silence as 6 four-star generals, led by the chairman of the Joint Logistics Command, entered the space, their chests covered in rows of distinguished service ribbons. Brandon instantly snapped to attention, his spine rigid, his arm rising in a crisp military salute as the senior leadership moved into the room. The generals did not look at Brandon. They walked past him, their eyes fixed entirely on Christopher. As they reached the small circle, the chairman stepped forward, came to a complete halt, and brought his hand to his brow in a formal salute, which was instantly mirrored by the 5 other 4-star generals behind him. The chairman's voice echoed clearly across the silent ballroom as he addressed Christopher by his full official title, stating that the senior staff was ready for the executive briefing whenever the senior director was prepared. The effect on the audience was instantaneous and visible. Arthur's face turned completely white, his hands trembling so violently that a few drops of his drink spilled onto his polished shoes. Brandon's arm remained frozen in the air, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and sudden, absolute shock as he looked from the generals to his quiet stepbrother. The surrounding crowd of 200 witnesses watched the interaction in stunned silence, their collective posture shifting as they realized the immense administrative power held by the man they had previously ignored. Christopher gave the generals a polite, measured nod, acknowledging their salute with absolute composure, before looking back at his family one final time. The consequences began to unfold the following Monday morning with the systematic precision of a controlled demolition. Because Christopher remained entirely passive, allowing the natural mechanisms of federal law and military discipline to take their course, the cascade carried in weight that no personal revenge could ever achieve. Brandon was the first to experience the full impact of the institutional shift. Before his morning unit assembly, he was met by 2 officers from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service who presented him with an official suspension of his security clearance and an immediate administrative hold on his active duty status. The evidence of his unauthorized private defense contracts, which Christopher had methodically compiled, triggered a formal investigation by the Maritime Oversight Committee. Within 3 weeks, Brandon's planned private consultation firm was entirely dissolved before it could even begin operations, as every corporate investor withdrew their funding to avoid federal scrutiny. His dream of a commercial empire vanished, replaced by the grim reality of a pending military tribunal that would ultimately result in a less than honorable discharge and the permanent forfeiture of his military rank. Arthur's professional world collapsed with equal speed. The regional bank branch he had managed for decades was subjected to an unannounced, comprehensive federal audit due to the irregular funds linked to Brandon's unauthorized corporate accounts. The audit revealed a long-standing pattern of compliance negligence and preferential treatment orchestrated by Arthur to benefit his biological son's financial interests, to avoid a public scandal that would destroy the financial institution's reputation. The board of directors forced Arthur into an immediate disgraced retirement, stripping him of his executive bonuses and canceling his remaining stock options. The community standing he had spent 30 years manufacturing dissolved over a single weekend, leaving him isolated in his empty house. Eleanor found herself caught in the social vacuum left by her husband and son's sudden disgrace. The local committee positions she valued so highly were quietly reassigned to other members, and the invitations to the neighborhood social gatherings that had filled her calendar simply ceased to arrive. The family sedan remained parked in the driveway, its polished exterior gathering winter dust as the phone in the hallway remained completely silent. The web of appearances she had helped construct had fallen apart, leaving nothing behind but the cold reality of a fractured home. Throughout this entire period, Christopher never issued a statement, never returned a phone call from his parents, and never posted a single word on social media, remaining completely focused on his national service while the dominoes fell around his old life. By the time the spring thaw arrived in April, Christopher had established a completely new domestic reality, far removed from the cold performance of his childhood home. On a warm Sunday afternoon, the sunlight streamed through the tall windows of a modest, beautifully restored farmhouse he had purchased near the Virginia hills, illuminating the natural grain of a long cherrywood table. The air inside the room was warm and inviting, smelling of fresh rosemary, roasted chicken, and hot sourdough bread. Sitting around the table was Christopher's chosen family, individuals whose presence was rooted in mutual respect rather than social ambition. His close mentor, a retired federal judge named Margaret, sat at his right hand, her silver hair catching the sunlight as she shared a humorous anecdote from her early days on the bench. Across from them sat 2 of Christopher's closest colleagues from the Pentagon, men who had stood by him during his quietest professional challenges, along with their young children whose laughter filled the open spaces of the house. The chairs around the table did not match perfectly. They were comfortable, worn, and chosen for utility rather than display. Christopher sat at the head of the table, wearing a comfortable linen shirt, his expression relaxed and completely at peace. He raised his glass of water, offering a quiet toast to the value of quiet endurance, the strength of true community, and the beauty of a life built on a foundation of honesty. There were no cell phones buzzing on the table, no discussions of social rank, and no anxieties about appearances. His biological family was entirely absent from the frame, their names unmentioned, their memory fading into the background like the winter frost. As the afternoon drifted into evening, Christopher looked around the room, feeling the genuine warmth of the space, knowing that he had finally built a home where his presence was truly valued for exactly who he was. If you are watching this story today and you recognize a familiar ache within your own life, please understand that you are not alone in your quiet endurance. It is an exhausting burden to exist in an environment where your worth is constantly minimized by those who should be your greatest protectors. But remember this truth: their inability to see your value does not diminish your actual worth, it merely exposes their own lack of vision. You are fully allowed to establish firm boundaries for your own psychological survival, and you are under no moral obligation to remain in spaces that require you to shrink so that others can feel large. You are allowed to walk away from toxic dynamics, you are allowed to protect your own peace, and you are allowed to build a chosen family that values your character over your performance. True strength does not look like shouting into the wind, it looks like the quiet, methodical preparation of your own independent life. If these principles resonate with your heart, please take a moment to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below, reminding yourself that your dignity can never be taken away unless you choose to surrender it. Stay grounded, keep moving forward in your own truth, and know that your time of quiet vindication will eventually arrive.